Hi, in this course we're going to see the most common faults on failed laptops, and we're going to see the power adapter failure, the power jack faults, the RAM or random access memory faults, the graphic card faults, the super I/O IC or super input output, the charge IC faults. I'm going to show you how to diagnose the charge IC, the BIOS or basic input output system faults. The short circuit, I'm going to show you how to find easily the short circuit. The power battery or the laptop battery. The protection components including fuses, diodes, etc. The MOSFETs. The ports and connectors. The USB, the power button, the CMOS battery, the HDD or SSD, the dry soldering, the electrostatic faults, and much more. So, in this course, we're going to discuss all these points step by step, and I'm going to teach you how to solve and repair these common faults. So, what are you waiting for? Enroll now and let's get started. So, here as you can see, this is the adapter. So, we're going to check the adapter. So the adapter among the common faults in a failed laptops. So, if you have a failed laptop, you should first check the adapter using the multimeter. Because if the adapter is not okay, the laptop cannot be operated. So to check the adapter, you should just put the black probe of the multimeter in the negative terminal and the red probe in the positive terminal. So to use the multimeter, you should set the multimeter to the DC voltage option, okay? And of course, you should always select the higher value. If you have, for example, an adapter with 19 volts, you should choose 20 volts. But if you have an adapter with 20 volts or more, you should choose 200 volts and so on. Okay? So you should always choose the higher voltage or the higher value. So put the black probe in the negative terminal and the red probe in the positive terminal to check the adapter. And of course, there is a pin or the third terminal is for to charge the battery. Okay? And of course, you should always pay attention to the specification that is marked over the adapter. Especially when you want to change your adapter, you should change it with another adapter with same characteristics. If, for example, the adapter is a 19 volt adapter, you should change it with a 19 volt adapter. So for example, for this adapter, as you can see, we have 19 volt DC and 4.74 amps. Okay? So always you should pay attention to the output of every adapter. Okay? For example, for this adapter, we have here 19 volt. You should measure 19 volt using the multimeter. So as you can see here, this is the power jack. As you can see, this is one of the most failure that you can encounter in the laptops. Okay, as you can see here, the back of the power jack, we have two terminals, negative and positive terminal. Okay, so as you can see, always near to the power jack you will find some components, the protection components, like a fuse, for example. Okay, as you can see, this is the fuse here. Okay, so and switches, Okay, so always near to the power jack you will find protection components. Okay, so the back of the power jack or in the other side, here we have the terminals or pins. You should always check the soldering. The soldering should be good. Okay, if there is a dry in any pin or terminal, you should make another solder. Okay, so as I told you, the power jack is among the common faults of failed laptops. So as you can see, to make a new solder, you can just use the soldering arrow and the solder, okay, to make a good contact. So here, as you can see, this is another motherboard, but this time the power jack is connected to a cable. As you can see, it's not connected to the motherboard directly. As you can see, here we have the connector instead of the power jack. Okay, so as you can see, this is the power jack. Okay, as you can see, here we have two terminals, the positive and in the sides, the negative terminal. Here we have the cable. So for this kind of power jack, you should check the cable. Okay, using the multimeter, you can check the continuity of these cables. As you can see, two red cables and two black cables. So the black cables for the ground and the red cables, of course, for the 19 volts or 20 volts in accordance with the type of the laptop. So as you can see, this is the first pin here. Always the first pin is marked with a triangle. So here we have switches, as you can see, two switches. Okay, and near always to the power jack or to power jack connector, you will find a protection components. This is another motherboard where we have the same working principle. This is a power jack that is connected to a cable. Okay, the same working principle. To check this kind of power jack, you should check the power jack itself and the cables or the extension. Here we have two red wires and two black wires for ground. So for this kind of connector, it contains 5 terminals, but just 4 terminals and are worked, as you can see. Okay, 2 terminals are connected to the black wires and 2 other terminals are connected to the red wires, but the middle terminal is not used, as you can see, not connected. So if you can understand one motherboard, you can repair and understand any other motherboard, because the working principle in the laptop motherboards is the same. Okay, so here we have another motherboard. Of course, I will show you many motherboards in order to go deeper into understanding the motherboards. Here we have a power jack for this motherboard. This is an old motherboard. Okay, here as you can see, we have the positive terminal connected to the motherboard, as you can see. So in the other side, as you can see, we have the terminals. Okay, you should always check the soldering or the solder state. If you find a dry in any terminal, you should apply a new solder. Okay, of course using the soldering iron. So for this power jack, it seems that it is good, but basically this power jack for this motherboard is bad. Okay, so as you can see, the switch, always you will find the switch near to the power jack, the switch or the MOSFET, okay, that let the power to pass to the whole motherboard. So as you can see, for this power jack, it is burned out, as you can see in the picture. That's why I told you this is a bad power jack. It is a burned power jack. So the power jack is one of the most common faults in the laptop. You should always check the power jacks, especially when you get a dead laptop. you should check the power jack first. Okay, of course, after the adapter. Now we're gonna see the RAMs, as you can see. So the RAMs also, or the random access memory, can cause failure or a not working laptop. So as you can see here, we have the RAM, the random access memory. As you can see for this laptop, you can open it or remove it just by pulling the two sides terminals. Here we have, as you can see, the RAM, okay, connections. As you can see, the RAM connections. So if you have a problem with the RAM or with the graphic, you can just clean the RAMs and the RAM slots, because sometimes when you have some dirt in the RAM slots, this can cause the problem in the laptop. So you can just clean the RAM chips and also the RAM slots. So as I told you, the RAM or random access memory is also one of the most common faults in laptops. Okay, that's why you should always check it and clean it. And of course, depending on the type of the laptop, there is many types of the RAM. For example, for this kind of laptop, this is a DDR2. As you can see, we have here 1.8 volt. So 1.8 volt is the working voltage for DDR2 RAM. Okay, and there is many types of RAM. For example, DDR3, the working voltage is 1.5 volt. DDR1, the working voltage is 2.5 volts. For DDR4, the working voltage is 1.2 volts. DDR5, this is a very improved RAM, the working voltage is 1.1 volt, and so on. So do you see 1.8 volts means the working voltage for the DDR2. You can just know the type of the RAM by knowing the voltage that is marked in the slot of the RAM. This is another motherboard with the same RAM. Here we have, as you can see, its capacity 512 megabyte, as you can see. Okay, the capacity of the RAM. So there is, of course, many capacities for the RAMs. So let's see this, for example, the capacity for this random access memory. As you can see here, we have 1 gigabyte. Okay, 1 gigabyte. This is Samsung. Samsung is the model. Okay. So this is 1 gigabyte. Of course, there is 2 gigabyte, 4 gigabyte, etc. Okay. So let's check. Here we have another motherboard. So this motherboard is for DDR3 RAM. This is an improved motherboard, a modern motherboard. Here, as you can see, this part here is next to the middle of the slot, means this is DDR3. This, but for this, no. As you can see, there is a big difference between DDR3 RAM and DDR2 RAMs. As you can see, the working voltage is 1.5 volts. Okay, for DDR2 1.8 volt, but for DDR3 1.5 volts. Okay, as you can see in the slot, 1.5 volts. So as I told you before, there is many types of random access memory, and for every type of RAM there is a working voltage, a specific working voltage. Okay, so let's see this motherboard also. Let's see the type of this RAM. So as you can see here, it seems that this is the DDR2. Of course, we have 1.8 volt. So this is DDR2 RAM. Okay, as you can see, this is 2 RAM chip. You can just pull this bars or arms, and the RAM will be removed easily. Just pull the arms and the RAM will be removed. Okay, so as I told to you before, the RAM chips can be the cause of no power laptop. You should always check the RAMs before going ahead and checking other things. For this RAM, as you can see, we have 512 megabyte DDR2, as you can see. Okay, for the other chip, 1 gigabyte. Okay, so here, as you can see, this is an old motherboard. As you can see, where we have an old RAM, we have here 2.5 volt. This slot is for DDR1 RAM. Okay, for DDR1 RAM. This is an old motherboard, and this is a modern motherboard. As you can see here, the graphic card and the GMCH is integrated with the processor in one chip. Okay, so here the RAM is DDR3. Okay, DDR3 with powering voltage of 1.5 volts. Okay, so you will find usually the modern motherboards. So of course this is i7 motherboard. Okay, this motherboard is for i7 laptop. You'll find the modern laptops, you will find the graphic card or the GMCH is integrated with the processor in just one chip. Okay, but for the old motherboards, you will find all chips are separated. For example, you will find the processor, the GMCH, the graphic card are separated. And of course, in some motherboards, some improved and modern motherboards, you will find that the processor, the GMCH, the graphic card, and the ICH are integrated in just one chip. So now, as you can see, this is the power jack. Okay, this is the fuse, as you can see here, the fuse near to the power jack, as you can see, and other protection components. Okay, so this is a fuse. Here we have the switch, the first switch, the second switch, the diode, as you can see. This is the diode, the Zener diode. This is for protection. And here we have two coils, as you can see, and two capacitors. Okay. And here, as you can see, this is a fuse with 0 above it, a fuse. So all these components are for protection. Okay. So among the common faults is a bad component in the protection stage, because this component is made to protect the whole motherboard from a high voltage or a high current. Here also, as you can see, always you will find a diode in the protection components. So as you can see, this is the power jack connector. Here we have the diode. As you can see, this is the diode. Always the diode is a protection, is an important protection component in every motherboard, because one side of the diode, the anode is connected to the ground and the cathode is connected to the power rail. When there is a problem, the diode will be shorted to the ground in order to protect the whole motherboard. Here we have the Zener diode, as you can see. Here this is two coils, okay? Two coils, as you can see. Okay, all these components are for protection. In every motherboard, you will find near to the power jack the protection components. The protection components is made to protect the motherboard from a high voltage or a high current. Okay, so you will find diodes, sometimes fuses, coils, capacitors, etc. Okay. So let's see this motherboard also, as you can see. So this is the power jack connector here. For this motherboard, the power jack is connected to a cable and then to this connector, as you can see. So here we have many components. So let's find out the diode. Always the diode is the main component in the protection components. So as you can see here, okay, so here this is the power connector, as you can see, Okay, and near to power connector we have the diode, as you can see. Okay, the diode is for protection. When there's a problem in the voltage or current, the diode will be shorted to the ground and then protect the other components and other circuits. Okay, here we have two coils, as you can see. Always or usually you will find coils near to the power connector, and the diode, of course, sometimes you can find the fuse, etc. Okay, so the protection component, especially the diode or the fuse, are one of the common faults in laptop motherboards. So let's check this motherboard also. We'll see the same working principle. As you can see, the power jack is connected to this motherboard via a cable. This is the power connector. Okay, the power connector, as you can see, that contain, here we have switches, two switches, and of course we have the diode. Always you will find the diode. One side of the diode is connected to the ground, okay, and the other side is connected to 19 volts or 20 volts depending on the type of the laptop. Okay, so one side is connected to the power rail and the other side is connected to the ground. When you have a problem, a high voltage or a high current, the diode will be shorted directly to the ground and then prevent other circuits from damage. Okay, so as you can see, so this is the diode, always a black component. A rectangle black component is the diode. As you can see, we have D21, the reference for this diode. As you can see, this part is correct, as you can see. Okay, this is the diode. Always the anode part is connected to the ground, and the cathode or the negative part is connected to the power rail. So among the common faults in laptop motherboards is a shorted diode or a bad fuse in the power circuits. Okay, near to the power jack or near to the power jack connector. Always when you get a bad motherboard or a no power laptop, you should check the components near to the power jack or near to the power jack connector, especially the diode, fuse, coils, Zener diode, etc. Okay, so as you can see, we're going to see the switches. Okay, so the switches or the MOSFETs, always you will find near to the power jack or the power jack connector two switches or in sometimes one switch. Okay, this switches is the gate of power in every motherboard. Okay, so among the common fault in the laptop motherboard is bad MOSFETs or bad switches. Okay, so as you can see, for this motherboard, for example, this is the power jack. As you can see, this is the first switch or MOSFET, the second switch, as you can see. Okay, and here we have the fuse. Okay, we called it switch because it deals like a switch. Okay, it let the power pass or block the power to the whole motherboard. That's why we called it a switch. Okay, so if there is a problem or if this switch is damaged, the power will not get into the motherboard and you will get a dead motherboard. Okay, that's why you should always check the switches near to the power jack if you get a bad motherboard. Okay, as you can see also in this motherboard here, this is the power jack connector. Okay, it is connected to the motherboard via a cable. Here we have the first switch or MOSFET and the second MOSFET. Okay, so these two MOSFETs let the 19 volt to pass to other circuit in the motherboard. As you can see here, we have points. These points means the 19 volt will go to 7 place in the motherboard, because we have here 7 point means 7 place or 7 circuit. So as I told you, in every motherboard you will find after the power connector or the power jack one MOSFET or two MOSFETs. That is like a bridge or like a switch. Here, as you can see in this motherboard, this is another MOSFET here with 3 terminals, as you can see. Okay, so this is a switch for this motherboard, just one MOSFET. Okay, for those MOSFET, as you can see, those are for the 3 volt and 5 volt power system. Okay, these 4 MOSFETs, 2 for to generate 3.3 volt and other 2 to generate the 5 volt. Okay, now we're going to see the charge IC. So the charge IC, as you can see, is always you will find it near to the power jack and near to the power component. As you can see, this is the power component or the protection component, this is current sense resistor, and this is the charge IC. So if there is a problem in the charge IC, the laptop cannot be operated. Okay, the charge IC is the control management IC for the power, especially in the power circuit. Okay, as you can see, around the charge IC we have many components, especially ceramic capacitors. Okay, as you can see, many ceramic capacitors, and also we can find fuses or resistors, etc. So as you can see, to check the serviceability of the charge IC, you should check the ceramic capacitors around it. If you find any shorted capacitor, means you have a bad charge IC. Okay, so the ceramic capacitor around the charge IC should not be shorted. If you find any shorted capacitor, means the charge IC is bad, you should replace it. Let's see another motherboard, as you can see here. So here, as you can see, this is the connector that is connected directly to the power jack via a cable. Here we have the power component, as you can see. Okay, here this is the battery connector. Normally the charge IC should be here, but let's see the other side. So as you can see, here we have the charge IC in the back side of the power connector. Okay, so this is the charge IC, and here we have the component around it. Always you should focus on the capacitors. Okay, capacitors, using the capacitors you can know whether the IC is good or not. Always you should put the multimeter to the buzzer or continuity option and check the capacitors around the IC. If you find any shorted capacitor, means the IC is bad. You can also touch the IC using your finger. If you feel a hit over the IC, means the IC is bad. As you can see here, also we have another motherboard near to the connector, power jack connector. As you can see, we have here the protection component like a diode, etc. Here this is the battery connector, and here as you can see we have the charge IC. As you can see, we have here component around it, we have capacitors. So let's see this motherboard also. This is another motherboard. Of course, I will show you many kind of motherboards in order to go deeper into understanding what I'm seeing. Okay, so here we have the power jack connector, switches, we have the diode, as you can see. Okay, this is the power circuit. Okay, so normally the charge IC should be here next to the power jack, but as you can see, if you don't find it next to the power jack, you should check the battery connector. As you can see, we have the power IC here. Okay, so the power IC is always surrounded by many components, and among these components we have the ceramic capacitors or the PF capacitors. which you can use to determine whether the IC is bad or not. Okay, as I told you before, if you find any shorted capacitor, I mean ceramic capacitor, that means the IC is damaged. Okay, you can also use your finger to check the heat of the IC. If you find any heat over the IC, means the IC should be replaced. So this is the super I. As you can see, this mark means here we have the pin number 1, as you can see. And this is the direction of reading. Okay, always read in the counterclockwise. Okay, counterclockwise. Okay, so of course the super IO is near to the ICH and to the BIOS. So here in the motherboard we have another super input output IO. As you can see, here we have this dot, means this is the pin number 1, and this is the direction of the reading. Okay, usually you will find in the super IO 128 pins. Okay, so of course there is many types of super IO. Okay, there is win bond, there is many type of super IO, or ENA, as you see here. Okay, but usually the numbers of pins is 128. As you can see here, the super IO is usually next to the ICH. Here we have this triangle, means this is the pin number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay, so you can find triangle or dot or line next to the pin number 1. Okay, so the working principle for the motherboard is the same. So if you understand one motherboard, you can analyze and study and of course repair any other motherboards you encountered. Here we have another SIU win bond. As you can see, this is a win bond IO. As you can see, here we have this triangle. The big triangle means here we have the pin number 1. Okay, and this is the direction of reading, as you can see. Okay, the same working principle. It's pretty easy to hardware of laptop motherboards, and I show you many motherboards in order to master the hardware of the motherboards. Here we have another SIO, as you can see, a big SIO that I already removed, desoldered and soldered again, because this is just to show to my students in a previous course how to do this desoldering and soldering operations. As you can see, this is dot, a white dot means this is the pin number 1, as you can see. Okay, and always here, as you can see, near to the ICH. Okay, the power switch. Okay, when you troubleshoot your laptop, you should always check the power switch. Normally the power switch contain 2 terminals, a negative terminal that is connected to the ground and a positive terminal that is connected to 3.3 volts. Okay, because if the 3.3 volt does not exist in the terminal of power button, you cannot switch on your computer even if you press the power button. So the 3.3 volt should be present in the power switch in order for the computer to be on. Okay, so always you should check the terminals of the power switch. You should find 3.3 volts in one terminal. So one terminal is connected to 3.3 volt and the second terminal is connected to the ground. I will show you the schematic or the circuit diagram of the power switch. As you can see here, the power button or the power switch. Okay, I will show you right now its circuit diagram. So let's assume that this is the power switch. Okay, so here this is the first terminal that is connected to the ground, as you can see. Okay, ground, and over here let's draw the second terminal that is connected to the power rail, or to the 3.3 volt, as you can see. So when you check the power switch, you should find 3.3 volt in one terminal. So when you press the power switch, the 3.3 volt will be 0 volt, because you connect between the power rail and the ground. You will get 0 volt and the laptop will be on. Okay, so if you don't find, when you check one terminal of the power switch 3.3 volt, means the 3.3 volt is missing. If the 3.3 volt is missing, you cannot switch on or power on your laptop. Hi, so in this lecture we're gonna see the BIOS, the basic input output system IC. Here, as you can see, we have this motherboard here, we have the Super IO, as you can see. Here we have the BIOS. Okay, always you can find the BIOS near to the Super IO. Okay, so this mark means the pin number 1 for the BIOS. So here, as you can see, this is the pin number 1. Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so as I told to you, the BIOS is usually near to the super input output IC. Okay, so we're gonna see many motherboards in this course. Okay, so for the BIOS, if you can't check it, when you power the motherboard, you should check the pin number 8. And of course, in the pin number 8 of every BIOS, 8-pin BIOS, you should, or you have to find 3.3 volts. Okay, here we have another motherboard. Okay, where we're going to see another BIOS, as you can see. So this is another BIOS, 8-pin BIOSes. Okay, so here, as you can see, we have the ICH. Okay, and this is the Super IO. Okay, so usually the BIOS, you can find the BIOS near to the ICH, okay, or to the Super IO. Okay, so usually these three components are near to each other. Here we have this mark, means here we have the pin number 1. We have this dot here, means pin number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so the same working principle. Here we have the pin number 8, where you should find 3.3 volt when you power the motherboard. Okay, so the BIOSes in the motherboard have the same working principle. Okay, here, as you can see, we have another motherboards for an HP laptop. Here we have the BIOS, as you can see. Always you can find that the BIOS is bigger than the MOSFETs. Okay, so let's see the other side. Here we have the Super IO. As I told to you before, usually the BIOS is next or near to the Super IO, but in this motherboard, the Super IO is in the back side of the BIOS. Okay, so as I told to you, this is another motherboard for an HP laptop. We're gonna see many motherboards in order to master and in order to understand clearly, okay, the BIOS or the working principle for the BIOS. Here we have this white dot, means this is the pin number. So this is another motherboard. Okay, this is also for the HP laptop. Here we have the ICH, as you can see, or the South bridge. Here we have the North bridge, and this is the processor. Okay, the processor, the North bridge, and the ICH. Okay, here we have the SIO, or the super input output. This is the BIOS. Okay, here, as you can see, we have this line, the white line here. Okay, means this is, and we have this hole, of course, here, means this is the pin number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so always the same working principle. And usually when you want to determine the place of the BIOS in the motherboard, just look for the ICH or the third bridge and the super IO. You can find usually the BIOS or always the BIOS near to the ICH or near to the super IO. And sometimes these three components are gathered in one place, as this example of this motherboard, as you can see. So in this lecture, we're going to see one of the most common or frequently failure in the laptop, the graphic card. So as you can see here in this laptop, the graphic card is integrated with the processor, as you can see. Okay, here we have the ICH. Okay, this small IC, and this is the graphic card with the CPU. So for this laptop, the CPU, the graphic card, and the NOT bridge are integrated in just one chip, as you can see, the CPU. Okay, but in some other motherboards, as you can see, for example, for this motherboard, as you can see, we have here the CPU, the NOT bridge with the graphic card, as you can see, and the ICH. Okay, so here, this is the NOT bridge with the graphic card. So for this laptop, the graphic card and the NOT bridge is separated from the CPU. Okay, so we're going to see another laptop. As you can see, for this laptop, we have here, as you can see, the CPU and the NOT bridge is integrated in one chip. Okay, and here we have the graphic card. This is the graphic card. Okay, and here, as you can see, the ICH. Okay, so let's see another motherboard where we have all chips are separated from each other. So as you can see, this is the CPU, the NOT bridge. Okay, here we have the graphic card, NVIDIA graphic card, and over here we have the ICH. So all chips are separated from each other. So this is for the old motherboard, but for the newer motherboard, or like this motherboard, for example, the three chips are integrated in one chip. So the processor, the NOT bridge, and the graphic card. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to repair the graphic card problem. Sometimes you can get a laptop with no data or nothing in the screen. So the graphic card is one of the common faults that can cause this problem. The RAM, the random access memory, or the graphic card. If you have no data, you check the random access memory and the problem still persists, you should apply a hot air or a heat to the graphic card, as you can see. Okay, you should use the hot air gun and then apply a little bit of the heat over the graphic card body. Okay, so this technique can correct the soldering under the graphic card. And of course, you should use a soldering paste. This is a soldering paste, as you can see. The characteristics of the soldering paste, as you can see, we have join high, intensity, good, immersion, neutral, as you can see, no poison, no origin, good insulation. Okay, this is a good insulation. This is one of the most important characteristics. Okay, no deterioration or no dry. So the soldering paste makes things easier. You should always use it above the graphic card and then apply the heat using the hot air gun over the body of the graphic card, and this will correct the problem of the dry solder under the graphic card. I will show you right now the solder under the graphic card. It looks like this, as you can see. So this is an empty place for a chip. As you can see, this is the solder. When there is a dry or a problem in this solder point, this can make a disconnection between the graphic card and the motherboard. That's why you should apply the heat. Okay. Now we're gonna see the CMOS battery. Okay, the CMOS battery, as you can see, the CMOS battery is usually about 3.3 volt. As you can see, this is the CMOS battery connector. You will find two pins or two terminals, one ground and one high terminal. Okay, so this is a kind of CMOS battery. Here we have two wires, as you can see, red and black wire. There is many types of CMOS battery. Okay, so for this CMOS battery, it has just 2.4 volts. Okay, but usually you will find 3.3 volt in CMOS batteries. Okay, so the CMOS batteries are very important in every motherboard, for the laptop or for the desktop. Okay, because the CMOS battery keeps the data, the configuration saved in the ICH. As you can see here, we have another type of the CMOS battery, as you can see. Okay, this is a big one, as you can see. Here we have in this connector plus and minus. So I will show you the plus and the minus. So let's zoom in a little bit. As you can see now, it's clear. We have plus here and we have minus here, as you can see. Okay, so this is 3.3 volts battery. Okay, as I told you, this battery is responsible to keep data and configuration about the CMOS chip saved. Okay, even if you unplug the computer. Okay, here we have the plus terminal and here we have the minus terminal. Okay, so let's insert the battery. So always, as I told you, if you understand one motherboard, you can understand every laptop motherboard, whatever its type, is it old or newer, etc., because the working principle is the same. As you can see, this is the positive terminal here, and as you can see, the CMOS battery also is usually near to the ICH. Okay, as you can see, so CMOS battery, the ICH, the BIOS chip, and the SIO are usually near to each other. Okay, so as you can see in this motherboard, this is an enhanced motherboard. Okay, this is a modern motherboard. As you can see, this is a motherboard for i7 processor. Okay, so here we have another motherboard. As you can see, the same working principle. We have here the CMOS battery slot. As you can see here, this is the negative terminal, and here we have the positive terminals, and here we have the ICH, and this is the crystal oscillator. Of course, you will find a crystal near to the ICH. As you can see, the crystal near to the ICH and near to the CMOS battery. Here we have the XY or X1 or Y1. Okay, the reference for crystals is X or Y. Okay, so in some motherboards you will find X and in others Y. Okay, always you will find the CMOS battery not near to the ICH, and the ICH is always near to the SIO and the BIOS chip. Okay, this is a good information. As you can see here, this is the connector for the CMOS battery. The CMOS battery for this motherboard is removed. So this is the connector, as you can see. Here we have the ICH, as you can see here. Okay, so the ICH, this is the BIOS, and this is the SIO. As you can see, the four components is near to each other. Okay, the CMOS battery, the ICH, the BIOS, and the Super IO. Okay, So usually the four components are next to each other. As you can see also for this motherboard, as you can see, we have the CMOS or battery slot, the ICH, the BIOS, okay, and this is the Super IO, okay. So I try to teach you the basics and the working principle, okay. So here we have the BIOS, as you can see. This is the Super IO, as you can see here, and this is the CMOS battery. And now we're going to see another common fault that you can encounter in laptop motherboard is the problem of the HDD or hard disk drive. So when you have a problem with the hard disk drive, the laptop can be powered on, but you will get no data in the screen, okay, no data, okay. So that's why you should check the HDD. As you can see here, we have the HDD connector, okay. This is the SATA connector or serial HDR connector, as you can see here. So let's zoom in a little bit. As you can see, so here this is the SATA connector for the HDD or for the hard disk drive. Of course, the same working principle for the HDD or ACCD, the solid state drive. So as you see, sometimes when you move your laptop or the laptop is full, you can get no data in your laptop. That's why you should always check your hard disk drive, okay. You can find it like this. If the hard disk drive is disconnected from the motherboard, as you can see, you can get no data in your motherboard, in your laptop. That's why you should always check the hard disk drive. The hard disk drive should be connected or mated to the motherboard. So this is also one of the common faults that I encountered in failed laptops. So as I told you, especially when you have no data in your laptop, you should check the hard disk drive, okay. And when you have nothing in the screen, just a black screen, you should check the BIOS, you should check the random access memory, and so on, okay. And sometimes the CMOS battery should remove and install back the CMOS battery, okay. So the hard disk drive can cause this kind of problems, no data in the laptop. That's why you should check it. Another common fault that you can encounter in the failed motherboard is the bad connectors, especially the connectors that contain pins, as you can see here. This pin can be bended. If there is a bended pin, this can make a short circuit in the motherboard, and then the laptop cannot be operated, or you can even get a dead laptop. So as you can see here, this connector is for the fan for the CPU, okay, that it contains 3 pins. So always you should pay attention for these connectors, especially the connectors that contain pins. But for this kind of connector, for example, for the HDD, as you can see, it doesn't contain pins, but it contains a metal terminal. Also, these terminals can be bended or broken, okay? That's why always you should check the connectors in the motherboards. A bad connector can cause a short circuit, okay? The same for the memory slots, as you can see. As you can see, sometimes you can find a bad memory slot. If you have a bad memory slot, the laptop cannot be operated, or you can get no power in the laptop. The same working principle. This is the network card slot, as you can see. Do you see these terminals? this should be clean and should be good. Here also, this is the connector for the power jack. Okay, so for this kind of laptop, it has this kind of connector that is connected directly to the power jack via a cable. Okay, so you should always check or do a visual inspection for the all connectors in the motherboard. Okay, so the connectors can cause a dead laptop motherboard and can cause, of course, short circuits. When there is a bended pin, for example, a ground pin that touch a power rail, it can cause, of course, a short circuit. So I will show you right now some connectors, some bad connectors. As you can see, for this is a screen connector. So this connector is for the screen or the monitor. As you can see here, we have about 2 bended pins. As you can see, 2 bended pins. So this connector should be repaired. As you can see, these bended pins are touch each other, so we can get here a short circuit, especially when the 2 pins that touch each other is ground and plus 5 volt, for example, or plus 3 volt, etc. Okay, so you should always pay attention. I get many motherboards with this kind of problems. Okay, as you can see here in the image, bended pins and this connector. So you should always do a visual inspection. That's why I told you that the visual inspection is very important before checking other things. You should first do a visual inspection. So as you can see in this motherboard, this is basically an old motherboard, but I find that this connector, as you can see, is damaged. As you can see, this is a bended pins. As you can see here, do you see bended pins? This is a bad connector. Okay, if you don't do a visual inspection, you cannot find out this kind of failure. Now we're going to see the USB connector or universal serial bus connector. So also among the common faults that you can encounter in a dead motherboards or failed motherboards is a bad USB connector, the same working principle. This connector contains the ground, the plus 5 volt, the D minus and D plus. I mean data plus and data minus. When these pins inside this USB connector is broken or bended or damaged, you can get a failed motherboard, especially when 2 pins touch each other. The same working principle also for other connectors like RG45. As you can see, this is RG45. It contains about 8 pins or 8 terminals. The terminals should be good, should not be damaged or bended. If you have any part that is damaged, you should replace it. So now I'm going to show you a damaged part. So a damaged RG45 port, as you can see here in the sides, in the right side, as you can see 2 terminals that touch each other, as you can see. So this is, as you can see, a damaged part. Now, as you can see here, we have another common fault, the dry solder. As you can see here, for example, for these ports, we have USB connectors and the audio connectors. If you have any dry solder or a terminal that is not connected perfectly to the motherboard, you can have a problem with your motherboards. Okay, this connector or ports can be USB connector, can be the VGA connector, can be a connector for the touchpad or for the keyboard, for the screen, etc. That's why you should check the soldering state in your motherboard, especially for the ports and connectors. This is also one of common faults that you can encounter in failed laptops motherboards, okay, especially for the power jack. Okay, if you have problem or a dry solder in the power jack, the laptop or the motherboard will be a dead motherboard. You cannot get no power, no light in the motherboard or in the laptop. So that's why you should check the soldering in the terminals, especially for the power jack. Of course, for the power jack and for other ports. Now we're going to see another fault that you can encounter in some failed laptops, especially dead laptops, is some blown ICs. Okay, so that's why you should always do a visual inspection for your motherboards before proceeding or going ahead and checking other chunks. You should always do a visual inspection because you can find a blown IC. If you find a blown IC, means the IC is damaged, or MOSFETs or any component, means you should replace that component with another component with a serviceable one. Now I will show you an example of blown IC that I find when I do a visual inspection. So this is a motherboard, as you can see, where we have a blown IC. As you can see, this is basically an IC. As you can see here, do you see this hole? This is a problem. This IC is blown out, as you can see. Now this IC is damaged. So that's why you should always begin with a visual inspection, because if you have an IC like this, you should change it automatically. But if you don't did a visual inspection, you can't just make measurement and check from here to here without finding the problem. So that's why the visual inspection is a very important step before doing any things. Now I'm going to teach you about the short circuit in the motherboard. How can we detect if there is a short circuit in the motherboard or not? So easy, by checking the continuity between the coils or inductors, as you can see, and the ground. Normally all inductors in every motherboard should not be connected to the ground. All inductors are connected to the power rail. Okay, so if you find any inductor that is shorted to the ground, means there is a short circuit in that circuit that inductor belongs to it. Okay, so as you can see here, we have many inductors. Okay, in each circuit you will find inductor, capacitors, and MOSFETs. We have inductor here, two terminals. If you check these two terminals with the ground, you should never find any short between inductor and the ground. Always inductor is connected to the voltage or to the power rail. Okay, so using the multimeter and by putting the multimeter to the continuity option or to the buzzer option, check between the inductor and the ground. If you found any low resistance or any continuity, means there is a short circuit. Of course, the low resistance should be 0 or 001 or 002. Okay, If you find 008 or 009, this is not a short, this is just the resistance of the CPU or the GMCH, etc. Okay? Now we're gonna talk about the electrostatic. You know electrostatic? The electrostatic can cause a bad motherboard or a failed laptop. The electrostatic is the residual current or voltage that can be held by some component in the motherboard, especially capacitors. So when you want to switch on the power, the laptop, it will not be on. No power. You can get no power or no data because there is a problem with electrostatic. So you should discharge this electrostatic or this residual current by removing all sources of power. For the laptop, you should remove the battery and the adapter and also the CMOS battery, and then press the power button about 13 seconds and then release it and then put back the CMOS battery, the battery for the laptop, and if you want the adapter, and switch on the laptop. So the electrostatic can cause a failure in laptop. So now let's summarize all what we have seen in this course. Okay, so the most common faults on failed laptops are, okay, we're going to see one by one. Okay, this is a summarize about all what we have seen. So let's begin with the first fault. So the power jack. Okay, the first fault that is happen always in laptop motherboards is a bad or a damaged power jack. As we have seen in the previous lecture, you should always check the power jack if you get a dead motherboard. Of course, you should check the integrity of the power jack and also check the solder, okay, in the power jack terminal. So the second fault is the power adapter. So if you have a bad power adapter, means no power we will get to the motherboard. The power will be missed. So you should always check your power adapter. Basically, this is the first step or first thing to check. Okay, so of course there is many type of power adapters. There's power adapters with 19 volt, 20 volt, etc. Okay, in accordance with the type of the laptop. So the third fault, common fault, is the random access memory or the RAM failure. Okay, sometimes you can get a laptop that has a problem of no data in the screen. So in this state, you should check the random access memory. If you have a bad RAM or a RAM that is not installed to the motherboard, you can get this error. Okay, so of course there is many types of memories. DDR1, okay, with working voltage of 2.5 volts, as we have seen before in the previous lecture. Okay, we have also the DDR2, okay, with working voltage of 1.8 volts, and then DDR3, okay, with working voltage of 1.5 volts. The fourth type of RAM is DDR4 with working voltage of 1.2 volts and DDR5 with working voltage of 1.1 volt. This DDR5 is a very improved RAM, okay, that has a very big frequency, okay. We find it in modern laptops, okay. So as I told you before in the previous lecture, you can know the type of your RAM by checking the slot. You will find the voltage over the slot. Okay? So the RAM capacities, of course, you can find many RAM capacities. Okay? So there is 128 giga or megabytes. I mean megabytes. Okay? And 256 megabytes, 512 megabytes, so and 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabytes, and 4 gigabytes, and so on. Always you multiply by 2. Okay, so this is just an overview about the RAM types and capacities. So let's say right now the next fault that you can get usually in laptops, the bended pins. Okay, this is a very common fault, a bended pins. So that's why when you get a bad or a damaged laptop, you should always begin with a visual inspection. Okay, begin with visual inspection and check all the motherboard components, including the connectors and ports. If you find any bended pin, you should repair it. Okay, because a bended pin can make a short circuit in the motherboard. So I will show you how. So let's assume that we have a connector that contain 3 pins inside it. Okay, 3 pins. Okay, so this connector, this is a good connector. Okay, this is a good connector. 3 pins are good, as you can see, no problem in this connector. But if there is a problem with the connector, for example, let's assume that we have 2 pins here. The third pin is a bended pin. Okay, is damaged pin. So that's why it touch the second pin. So here, as you can see, if we assume that the bended pin is VCC and the second pin is the ground, means we have here a short circuit. This is a problem. Okay, here you will get a short circuit. Okay, so that's why you should always check the connectors. Always you should check the connectors. So here we have a short circuit. The motherboard will be a dead motherboard, will stop working because of this problem. Okay, that's why always you should do a visual inspection, as I told you before, especially focus on connectors and ports in order to check whether you have a bad part or connector or not. So let's move to the next fault, the USB connectors. The same working principle as the bended pins. Okay, the USB connector also can be broken or can have a bended pin inside it. Of course, the USB connectors or other motherboard ports. The same working principle for the whole ports in the motherboard. So let's assume that we have here a USB connector. This is just a symbol. So the USB connector or universal serial bus contains basically 4 terminals, okay, or 4 pins. Okay, so as you can see here, let's draw these 4 pins. Okay, so the first terminal is VCC in the right. Okay, the first terminal in the right is the VCC. The VCC is always in the USB equal to 5 volts. Okay, so and the terminal in the left of the USB port is connected always to the ground. Okay, so this is a ground. Okay, and the 2 terminals in the middle is the minus data and the plus D. Okay, minus D and plus D. This is for data. Okay, this is for data. If you want to transfer data or from USB to computer or from your computer to USB key. Okay, so this is for data. So this is the symbol for the USB port or USB connector. Okay, so let's assume, for example, if you have any bended pin here or any damaged pin that touch the pin next to it, this can make a short circuit in the motherboard, and sometimes this problem of the USB port can damage the ICH or circuit bridge because the USB port is connected directly to the ICH. Okay. Then we have the graphic cards. Of course, this is a very common fault. The graphic card is a very common fault that cause the problem of no data in the screen. If you have a bad graphic card, you can get a black screen, no data. Okay, that's why there is many technique to repair the graphic card is to overheat the chip, okay, using the hot air gun. Okay, so the next we have the charge IC or the PWM IC or power management IC. Of course, always you should check this kind of IC. Okay, so how we can check the power management IC? Let's assume that this is the IC, for example, in the motherboard. Always next to the IC, you will find ceramic capacitors around the IC, okay? And the ceramic capacitor, in one side it is connected to the IC, and in the other side, the ceramic capacitors are connected to the ground, okay? So, if you find any shorted capacitor, means the IC is shorted to the ground. If you find any shorted capacitor, means the IC is bad. Okay? So this is a very important information and a very important tip that every technician should know. This is a secret on hardware repairing. Any shorted capacitor means the IC is shorted. Okay? You can check all capacitors. If you find anyone that is shorted to the ground in both sides, means the IC is bad. You should replace it automatically. Okay, of course you should use the multimeter and select the continuity option and check the ceramic capacitor. The ceramic capacitor should be shorted to the ground in just one side, not in the both sides. Okay. Now let's move to the next fault, to the next common fault, the short circuit. Okay, the short circuit in the motherboard. How can we determine whether there is a short circuit in the motherboard or not? The answer is inductors or coils. So as you know, inductors in every motherboard should never be connected to the ground. Always the inductors are connected to the power rail. Okay, so I will show you how. Let's assume that we have here an IC, okay, a power management IC. So, and we have a coil here and two MOSFETs, Q1 and Q2, and here this power management IC will generate 3.3 volts. Okay, so the first MOSFET, of course, will be connected to the power rail 19 volts. Okay, so the drain of the first MOSFET is connected to 19 volts, and its source, as you can see, should be connected to the drain of the second MOSFET. Okay, and here we have the upper gate connected to the IC. Okay, this is the control signal for the first MOSFET, and here we have the lower gate, okay, for the lower MOSFET, and here connected to the ground. So the 3.3 volt will be generated through the coil L or the inductor. So as you can see here, the coil is not connected to the ground, you will never find a coil that is connected to the ground in the motherboard. So if you check the coil using the multimeter and you find that is shorted to the ground, means there is a problem, there is a short circuit in that circuit. Of course, in the output we will find always capacitors, especially a chemical capacitor or polarized capacitor. If there is any short in those components, capacitors or MOSFETs, or even the IC, you will find that the coil is shorted to the ground. Okay, so if the coil is shorted to the ground, means there is a problem in the IC or MOSFETs or capacitors. Okay, so that's why if you want to determine the short circuit in the motherboard, you should check all inductors. All inductors should never give a low resistance or a continuity to the ground. Okay, so the next common faults that you can get in the motherboard is the super I/O failure. As you know, the super I/O is the IC that is responsible for the whole power in the motherboard. Okay, and the super I/O contain about 128 pins. Okay, 128 pins, and you can find many types of super I/O like ENA or WIN bonds, etc. Okay, but usually with 128 pins. So the super I/O or the power management IC. Okay, so this IC also is one of the common fault in the motherboards. Okay, so the next failure that is among the common fault in the laptops is protection components. Okay, the protection components like diodes or fuses, etc. Can find sometimes ceramic capacitors. Okay, so this components is always near to the power jack. This component has as a purpose to protect the whole motherboard from a high voltage or a high current. As you can see, you have the diode here, okay, in this motherboard. So they protect the circuits of the motherboard from a high current or a high voltage. Okay, that's why we called it a protection component. Here, for example, in this motherboard, we have a fuse, as you can see here, next to the power jack. This is the fuse. If there is a high voltage or a high current, the fuse will be blown out and then protect the other circuits in the motherboard. So let's assume that this is the power jack, for example, for the laptop. Here we have, as you can see, 19 volts. Okay, we have two wires and the other two wires are connected to the ground. Let's assume that this 19 volts should be passed through a fuse. A fuse is a protection component, then a double protection, the diode. The diode has the same purpose as the fuse. Also, the diode is for protection. Okay, so when there is, for example, a high current or a high voltage, the fuse will be blown out. Let's assume that the fuse is not blown out. The diode will be blown out, and then the motherboard components or circuits will be protected. Okay, so in this example, we have double protection, the fuse and the diode. Okay, that's why you should always check the protection component near to the power jack when you get a dead motherboard or a failed motherboard. Okay, so the next common fault is the CMOS battery. As you know, sometimes when there is a problem in the CMOS battery that has a 3.3 volts voltage between its terminals, the computer cannot be worked. You should replace the CMOS battery. Okay, so the CMOS battery, you can find usually the CMOS battery next to the south bridge or to the ICH. So the next fault that you can get in laptop motherboards is the HDD or SSD failure. The HDD means the hard disk drive, okay? And the SSD means the solid state drive. This is an enhanced drive, okay? So sometimes you can find a problem, no data in the laptop, and you should check the hard disk drive connector. Maybe the hard disk drive is not connected properly, okay? So the next failure is a dry solder. When you have a dry solder in every terminal in the motherboard, especially in the power jack connector or other connectors, you can get a bad motherboard, okay? You should put a new solder, okay? So always try to check the dry solder. So the next failure is a blown components. Of course, always, as I told you before, when you want to diagnose any motherboard, you should begin with the visual inspection. You should check all motherboard components, especially the ICs and MOSFETs, and look for any blown component or any burned component or damaged component. So the visual inspection is a very mandatory step that you should begin with. Okay, before proceeding to do anything, you should do the visual inspection. So we have also the power switch, okay, or the power button. So the power switch, if there is any problem in the power switch, even if the power is present, the adapter is good, the power jack is good, when you press the power switch, you will not get any response. So you should always check whether you have 3.3 volt in the power switch or not, okay? So the power switch has two terminals, one terminal connected to the ground and the other terminal to 3.3 volt. If you don't have 3.3 volt in the power switch, even if you press it, you will get no response, okay? So the next failure is electrostatic problems. Okay, so the electrostatic can cause the problem in the laptop, can cause a dead motherboard. That's why you should remove all source of the power like the battery and the adapter and press the power button and hold it about 20 until 30 seconds in order to discharge the electrostatic in the components like capacitors and coils, and then try to switch on the laptop normally. So the next failure is the switches or MOSFETs, as I told you before. So you will find always the MOSFETs, or as we called it, switches near to the power jack. So let's assume, for example, here we have the power jack, 19 volts in the power jack, and we have two MOSFETs or switches. So to get the plus VBAT or the main power for the motherboard, if there is any problem in one of the switch, that means the 19 volt will not pass to the motherboard, okay? That's why you should always check the switches or MOSFETs near to the power jack, okay? This is like a bridge between the power jack and the motherboard. The next or the last failure is laptop battery. So sometimes the laptop battery can cause the problem. If there is a problem in the laptop battery, it can cause a bad laptop or a bad motherboard. So you should remove it and try to power on the laptop using just the adapter. Okay, if the laptop is powered on using the adapter, means there is a problem with the battery. You should change it or boost it using 12 volts.